I will just like to ask first. I mean, you brought here diverse talents and investments in art, through visual art, with performance, theater, and also the art of the state or non-state through Birgitta. And given the title of the symposium, which I feel strives to enact a dialogue about how we're positioned vis-a-vis the state, but not always feeling that we are the state, but rather the non-state, right? So I want to ask each of you, what is the relationship of the state to your political, cultural activity? I will not differentiate at this point. I mean, to what extent is it relevant? Is the state where money comes from to support you? Is it something that your practice oppose? Is it something that your politics penetrates and tries to change, for instance? So there can be different positions. None of us is immune, I feel, from the power of the state and the state as power. And so I will ask Birgitta first, who was our speaker from this morning, from Iceland, with great political experience. Yeah.
Yes, so the state, you can't really avoid it if you are living in society. I'm not receiving money from the state, for me, the state is an extremely simple structure that's been made very complicated, and it's all embracing with its laws that are getting more and more complicated. And there's only two things I agree with Elon Musk on, and that's his idea on democracy, which is basically direct democracy and that laws should be simplified. I really think that since we are still believing that we need all these laws that are all driven through the state, and it's the fuel that keeps the state running, we should be much more interested in laws. And we should be much more interested in simplifying them. Because people tend to forget that the intention of laws was never to write about everything that we can possibly do wrong and be brought to justice. I mean, laws are really about that. I mean, sometimes they're supposed to protect us, but when you're trying to get your rights, that's not always the case. So we have forgotten the spirit of the laws. And I say this coming from Iceland because in Iceland the lawyers, and there's only been one legal department teaching lawyers to be lawyers, and the teachers there are sort of Bible bashers in the sense that they interpret the law exactly as it's written. Not the intention, but how it's written. And if you inspect how it is in your realities, that's exactly how it is. And this is the problem with the state. Because it is so bloody hard to change it if you're going to try to do it from within, if you don't have the masses to push for these change from outside. So if you ever have a fantasy about going inside to change things, make sure you have an army outside, because that's what our enemies do have.
Thank you very much.
I think for me, and I think everybody would agree at the moment in state, and when you look at the political atmosphere in the UK, it's quite messed up. And it has been like that for a while. And in terms of my practice using theatre, or even with Maryhill Integration Network, we do face state as the problem, because we work with people seeking asylum and refuge, and the reason why people are come to this country and they are seeing UK as a country based on human rights is because that's how it's been portrayed. And on the other hand, it's UK and allies like US and the others who bomb the Middle East and who bomb the countries and create this force of movement of people. So state for me in practice is it's very involved, and it's not just at work. It's involved. It's affecting everyone's life, I think, at the moment. Whether this is what we buy or whether this is our jobs or even the NHS. I mean, I don't know if people have seen, but Boris Johnson has been secretly talking with Donald Trump to make NHS privatize and sell off to US parts of the NHS. This is something that's, as people and as members of the public, we need to oppose and we need to raise our voices. And what you said, it's good to be within the parliament or have your say in the political structures. However, the mass movement is outside. If we don't demand change, if we don't raise our voices, then things will get passed, and then we'll end up just saying, well, we're not happy with it. So we need to intervene before it comes to that stage. There's Stella in the audience here, he's amazing young activist. So the young people, and you could see it with the climate change and with everything, I guess it's not just the young people, but as citizens of this country, that we all have a responsibility to play when making change and demanding our rights. Whether this is looking at migration, there's the anti-evictions movement in Glasgow at the moment, where asylum seekers were trying to be made destitute, and it was stopped, and it's at the court right now. It's just going to the higher court, and it was stopped because the local community and the people mobilized to say, no, we're not having this in our city, we're not having this in our country, we are a welcoming country, we're not going to have this. And that was just because of the power of people. And I think as a person who's been campaigning on ending detention and welcoming people, the important thing for me is when I see that all people uniting to fight for a cause, that rather than it's a problem for the migrants or asylum seekers and refugees. People are already tired, they're already facing a lot of issues, so you can't expect that just one community to face that problem to be their problem, their issue, and they can sort it. And I think the beauty is that when you see all communities coming together to unite and to fight and to say that no, we don't want this to happen and make changes. And like you said, it's the mass movements outside in the streets who needs to intervene. And I actually feel quite scared at the moment because we don't know what's happening going in terms of with UK, and hopefully with the general election that's coming up, the result will be. Hopefully the result will be to benefit the people rather than that Boris person. God, shouldn't even credit him. Anyways, I could rant, but I should probably pass it over to you.
We will come back to it. Yeah.
Rant. Yeah. Social contract, right? Rousseau, lawmakers. The social contract between citizens and the state, and it's obviously super broken. I guess for me. My state is gone. I come from former Yugoslavia. So I guess my relationship to it is that, as they say, it's easier to work with dead artists. It's easier to work with dead states. So I guess my strategies are to kind of forensically dissect these dead states or kind of failed illusions, because they do repeat themselves. And if we're looking at, we haven't really spoken much about sort of transnationalism and, the idea of the, global or, kind of what comes after nation states. And what is, for me personally, very interesting is kind of the first attempt at transnationalism. And obviously within the European space, that was the League of the Nations, which kind of miserably failed. It's almost like black humor. In a way, by the time the dead white men decide on how their palace is going to look, the war breaks up, and these are kind of like these kind of perverse cyclical narratives that keep on going. And I guess as creatives, we do have a different power of kind of interjection, because we can work with different with just different methods. Because we don't, abide to certain laws. And even when it comes to archives, if we find a hole in the archive, we can use that hole. we're not historians that need to sort of somehow, you don't have a thesis if you don't fill that hole. We can actually use these holes in the kind of the past histories as kind of progressive spaces. And also, I'm quite interested in kind of potential parallel histories that maybe never happened. And again, it's kind of like re-looking at these kind of terms of transnationalism, whether it's then, the non-aligned and so on. And again, the project of Yugoslavia is super interesting at the time of a failing Europe. Because, former Yugoslavia was kind of facing a very similar situation in terms of centralized funding. Also, one shouldn't forget that these were peace projects. The European Union was a peace project, which of course was kind of then, it kind of came from the trade, steel, unions and so on. But, they were trying to kind of embed and interject economics so much that the war would not be financially viable. And, we're looking at all these kind of histories and, I don't know, it's difficult. What I'm kind of scared of is that everybody is there's a lot of cultural kind of production that is scared and depressed, and I've never seen times like this in terms of this, what can we do and what can come next? And it's this kind of, I guess there was a bit of talk as well about this idea of, the support systems and, where do the kind of critical kind of creative practices sit in relation to the state, or how does the state enable this? And here I think that we are somewhat complicit in, kind of filling the, Arts Council questionnaires, whether our projects will help the old ladies cross the street or not. And it's this kind of micro-censorships that I think we need to kind of claim back and kind of say, do you know what, no, we're not going to stand for that. And we are going to kind of fight for, artist fees or whatever now within the kind of culture spectrum. I'm saying, it's just that it starts on a personal level, and I think this issue of starting with your community on a personal level has been really kind of quite disregarded, and I think this is what we kind of just need to kind of bring back.
Right. I will ask, I have this idea that perhaps I will just ask the audience straight away to respond to, if they want, to comment or to ask something directly after a round of a thematic round that maybe we're doing right now. Yes. There was someone else behind you, but yes.
I'll be formulating the question thinking aloud, so excuse me. It was just, I was speaking with a former lawyer who has now become an artist called Jack Tan that you might be familiar with this week. And he was talking about being taught at university as a lawyer, and that it's a function, because I have friends that are doing law but are politically isolated, so they don't feel comfortable voting. They don't know what they're voting for. They're disenfranchised. So what I was asking him was, how can that be that you could study law but not be interested in lawmaking? And I was just wondering, in terms of what you were speaking about, how, whether or not you've got an army outside, how could you go about thinking about expanding the law so that there's an ethical focus or a system of value systems embedded in those pedagogies? I don't know if that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, can I take the second question, because the two hands were simultaneous?
Yeah, can I just, because I have a weird brain, so if there's too many questions,
okay.
So maybe we can just answer directly instead of collecting, because then you forget maybe to answer properly. I don't know.
Sure. Yes. Which of the two microphones you want to use?
Yeah. So basically, this is a very good question, and this is why I am very fond of the idea of the assemblyism. So where you randomly select people from, there is a formula for, making it as diverse as possible. So you randomly select people to have access to experts, historical data, and you know, the story of the problem that you're solving, like they did in Ireland with the abortion issue and same-sex marriage. So after the assemblyism they had there, it was actually voted as a right. But before that, it was in sort of like yes and no camp, like we're seeing with so many different issues. So I think it is very important that in decision making, in particular when it comes like to, you know, the way we see ourselves reflected in our social structures, we have to be included, right? And so that's the army outside, because the army outside is also the people that think they live in democracy because they get to vote. That is not democracy. It's an illusion, it's bullshit. It is just because the people that get to go inside, they give themselves bunches of your money to run their campaigns, right? It's very difficult for newcomers to come in, and if newcomers try to change things, and my God, I did try, I was just like a constant annoying mosquito in the tent, and it's very tiresome, but I did, kept that promise. We, for example, we calculated how much does a political party need in funds to run as a grassroots organization, because that's the role of a political party, is not to just fork people into parliaments. It is to make people feel that they are engaged in an idea, in an ideology, in a vision. And that's just been totally forgotten. Plus, and this is very important, the politicians and their political parties have taken away from us the idea it's okay to be politically engaged. And being politically engaged means having thoughts. You are all political, unless you are just zombies and you don't think about anything. So you're all political, and it is not and will never be directly associated with some party politics. So people need to reclaim that. I am political, and it doesn't mean that I have to belong to any new religion called political parties.
Okay. Thank you. I was actually going to ask this question before. I was really fascinated by Jasmina's talk about her practice, and especially about the point about working in Budapest, given the circumstances. And maybe that's because I'm Polish and I'm looking at what's going on in Poland with the same thing, actually. So right-wing directors installed in museums by the government and sort of forcing an array of people out of cultural or art institutions. And so you said you were working with dead cultures or dead states, but actually you're kind of still engaged in states that are very much alive and that are changing, like Hungary, because you're showing your work there. And I was just, I would like to hear more about your position in terms of working with institutions that are both censored and also boycotted because of the censorship and because of the right-wing governments dominating over the exhibitions and events. And if you could expand on that and how you sort of position yourself doing what you do, but also sort of what you said about the ping pong between authorities and yourself and your practice. If you could just expand on that.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, the Hungarian situation and Budapest was, very specific in that moment of time, and unfortunately we are experiencing like more and more of these situations. And Poland, yes, absolutely, it's a really brilliant example, and it's really scary what's happening. Croatia's very similar because of the strength of the church. And of course, there's when you look at territories that don't have an art market developed, artists really don't have any other chance to make an uttering or political standing than to work with the state and the institutions which are state funded. So in terms of, for example, in terms of Slovenia, we do not have any public-private partnerships. We don't have an art market. Again, there was talks today about how kind of the art market doesn't really help because it goes into cohorts with like, you know, arts councils and so on. But, you know, if you have multiple discourses, then it's easier. And I mean, I personally, I don't work with galleries, which is sort of, you know, a blessing and a curse. So it does give me total freedom to decide on which invitation I will take and which one I won't. And I try to be just very, very ethical as much as I can in the approach to these kind of different grounds, because I always understand that, you know, if I'm not working within the history, I'm really understanding, I will be a tourist. And this is kind of something that kind of happened, for example, with the Ludwig situation, but I was really happy to be working with Rona Kopecki, who was an amazing curator with whom we could really sort of expand together on these structures and kind of find what kind of methodology would be best. And for example, when I showed the third chapter of Spielraum in Belgrade, so that was 2015, September, and it was when kind of the first waves of the kind of you know, immigrants and asylum seekers were kind of coming into Belgrade, and it was this totally absurd situation where we were opening this exhibition at in the Museum of Contemporary Art, and in front of it were these tents that were coming up from the first waves, you know, of the migrants. And you know, at that point, and I really kind of you know, Rebecca's video really pinpointed, you know, as an artist, as a socially and critically engaged artist, it's extremely difficult to say it's okay to keep doing art. And I think this is this kind of fundamental question that I kind of keep on returning to, because, you know, you are not working directly with the people that, you know, where you would want your interaction to happen, and they are not a part of the discourse, they are not a part of the audience. So what I try to do is I try to kind of then create this project as readers, I would say. So I really try to enable other researchers, writers, critics, philosophers to be then a part of publications, of symposia, of workshops. So we kind of try to expand, because, you know, if we don't do that, if I opt out, I'm not going to help anybody either. But it is a really fine line. I'm actually now about to work with the Polish Museum, and it's a really difficult one, because you kind of get to this situation of, you know, do you even accept these invitations? You know, and it's easier to say no to private foundations that are funded by arms manufacturing. That's kind of quite an easy one. But, you know, what do you do with countries? You know, for example, also with Israel, you know, do you take up an invitation from an Israeli museum, or you do not? So we're kind of facing more and more of these things. And I personally just try to then, you know, get acquainted with as much of information that I can, and I just make a personal decision. And it is just a personal decision, and it's back to being just, you know, yes, I'm a political being, and, you know, my politics are my personal politics, and that's okay.
Are there any other immediate questions? Right. I think yes. Sorry. Okay.
Got a question for Jasmina. I was wondering about choosing the gender in your videos of the people who speak, and kind of, if I understand right, they say things that are from archival research, right? So the gift, it was a kind of more a man speaking, narrating to her, whereas in the work downstairs is women having this debate. And I was wondering what drives you to these sort of decisions. How do you decide the gender?
So with Tear Down and Rebuild, it was sort of second kind of film where I used narration, and I kind of worked with script, and with this idea of taking historical political speeches and using quotes. So Tear Down and Rebuild was, I mean, in comparison to The Gift, it was a different strategy. So I wanted to really use quotes in their unchanged form and build characters which are not real characters. So in Tear Down, we have you know, sort of unaltered quotes, obviously translated, but from, you know, people as diverse as, you know, Margaret Thatcher, Mitterrand, Khrushchev, and so on. But they are kind of bouncing in between four allegorical positions, hence the kind of four women. So we have a pragmatist, a conservationist, an artist, and a nation builder. So, for example, Khrushchev at some point could be a nation builder, at some point he could be an artist. So it's this idea of also kind of showing this fragmentation of political speech and how it's kind of completely, kind of just, taking the tour that will arrive to the destination. And as to why I chose to work with 4 young women, it was really to do with the fact that within this building, so all the sculptures, as I mentioned in my talk, all the sculptures were of extremely eroticized female nudes. And when I was going through these archival documents relating to the non-aligned, there were women in those sessions, but in the transcripts they were never mentioned with their name. So all the men would be mentioned with the full name and surname, but for the women it would say a female voice from the background said. So, and it was just such a punctum that it kind of really felt, and I knew that okay, I'm kind of repeating again this structure because I'm using the 4 female allegories, personifications, but it made sense. So when I came to the gift, I must admit I did have like a really big session of brainstorming with my colleagues about how do we gender this. So this is just a part of a larger film. The plot is that 4 fundamental freedoms who are drafted from this speech by Roosevelt with which he was trying to convince America to enter the Second World War. So these 4 fundamental freedoms sit down and they try to figure out what is the best gift for a divided nation. And then these 3 gifts, 3 allegories, but in this case they are men, come together to propose their visions of the best gift that would heal this nation. And in terms of the 4 women, the 4 allegories, now this speech by Roosevelt is quite phenomenal because it was like the first political speech which was illustrated by a propaganda artist. So this was Norman Rockwell, who was probably the most famous, I would say, American propaganda artist. And he made these 4 paintings, 4 fundamental freedoms. I don't know if there's any Americans here. This is like the most successful propaganda painting ever in terms of also how much money it raised, because they were selling these images to get war bonds, effectively. And he, how he made the representations were that there was only one man, so it's freedom of speech, freedom from fear, freedom of worship, and freedom of want. And only freedom of speech is a man. And, I was like, we need to make this contemporary, we cannot kind of like repeat this because this is just not working. So I really try to, kind of really, as I'm working with this kind of historical ready-mades, I really then try to, certain things I try to kind of make, kind of translate, basically it's about translation, into a contemporary discourse where, even if it's kind of pointing to these kind of historical frisons, it's kind of, bringing them, it's elevating the discourse into like an understandable critique, I hope.
Okay, thank you very much. I feel somehow that the term the state, can be mystifying, and it really needs to be unpacked. There are, of course, states which are emancipatory and revolutionary states, the same way as we have nationalisms that can function this way, whereas mostly nationalism is a component of a fascist mentality, for instance. And this came through the question that addressed also, that mentioned Poland, where it's true that, for instance, recently in the art space called the Castle, when I was in Warsaw recently, I don't know if you were referring to this one, right? Okay. Sure, but this is a recent example, and it was addressed in a meeting, a big meeting, art meeting, an activist meeting on anti-fascism, and as it was happening those days. So, and because there was a mention of like right governments, for instance, what we're talking about here is there is an appointment of a director after having removed, the director previously, who was, of course, operating within this more liberal and, in fact, kind of like doing work that the Polish state considers, I don't know, Marxist or left or whatever, as always. And the person, the new person appointed, kind of like, there were clear examples of promoting racist, misogynistic, again, lesbian language and so on. So we really need to understand that there are different states, right? And perhaps try to assess our own capacities or willingness to participate in the work of the state in different ways. That's one way to look at it. The other way, which I tried to stress through my own interventions, had to do with how all of our states in Europe participate, irrespective of whether they have been actually colonial powers, participate in the exploitation and oppression of, of the South, of the global South, because of the transfer of value. And the role of our states, or the super state that's called EU or whatever else, and is fundamental, into keeping certain processes going. And I don't think, therefore, that the state, what we call the state, or the liberal kind of like democratic state that we think we're used to, which is being demolished, in many ways. And I'm very pleased that you brought up, of course, the leaked documents, because this is no longer a kind of suspicion or something that the Tories are planning really to sell, literally to sell, the NHS. So the question whether a health system, for instance, should be something provided by the state is a really important one, as opposed to provided by the markets. And the market, for instance, doesn't always work for the arts. We know that most artists in Scotland do not benefit from the market, and neither do artists, for instance, anywhere else. So it's a very complex question if we have to make this choice. In relation to all of this, Antonio Negri and Michael Hart have been arguing that we need institutions which are not just new, but they're actually monsters in changing us and in changing the relationship, to the state and so on. And what I want to ask all of you is whether they also call them institutions of the common, right? As opposed to institutions of the state, as opposed to, of course, private, institutions directly owned by capital. Personally, I don't see much difference between the states I happen to live and work and capital. They're completely kind of like integrated, we live in this hybrid world, so I don't think they can be extricated unless we have a revolutionary electoral outcome in some cases, so which is unlikely. And so what I wanted to ask you, nonetheless, is do you agree with this proposition of Hart and Negri that we actually need institutions that are not just transformative? Transformative sounds positive. To say that we need institutions that change us to the degree we don't recognize ourselves, right? Monstrous, that is, sounds negative. And I'm asking you, how far would you go in promoting in your work or being directly engaged into institutions which setting up institutions which completely disrupt the flow of our everyday reality, our everyday identifications, and so on? Would you go as far? I mean, we had a party called the Pirate Party, right? That's not part of everyday discourse. Who would like to answer?
I'm not sure if I understood the question, but I'll give it a try.
How radical can we go with the institutions we participate is the question. Because radicalness is not only something positive, it can be something which is really disrupting of our subjectivity.
So if we need an institution to be...
Yes, and would you, in your work, you have something called theater of the oppressed, or work with us.
Well, I think to make change, you don't need an institution. The purpose is to change the institution and not to have an institution. So for me, instead of looking at an institution or creating an institution where it's accepting or spending time there, I would rather try to find other methods of disturbing the current institution. And sometimes I'm just going to interpret that question in terms of, whether we should create something or whether we should accept it or make something different. Looking at like Augusto Boal, looking at his work, Theatre of the Oppressed, he, in one of his speeches, he said that it could easily be interpreted to Theatre of the Depressed. And that's because if you see everything is so bad and nothing's going to change, and you could easily fall into that thing of being depressed. And that's kind of how we felt at the beginning, looking at the state and looking at institutions, that how it's not going anywhere. For me, I think there are several steps if we were to look at making change, not within an institution. First is to understand your strength and your role within the community and within the kind of the institutions you are, or within the country that you're staying. The second is to look after yourself. I think that's something very important. You don't want to burn yourself out that you're not actually going to be useful to anyone, or you're not actually going to make any change, because you just want to make change so much that you're just going to burn out and not actually serve your purpose or not to do anything. And then the third thing is, if there are no institutions, or if the institutions do not represent you, you just go ahead without it and find creative ways to disturb. Just to show an example of how, relating back to the where racism happens, and we don't actually have to look far to other European countries or anywhere else. In UK and in Alloa last year, the local community, some racists spread the word that there was 100 asylum seekers being housed in the community, and the racists from down south, like from England, they put people on a bus, like the EDL and stuff, and they brought people to Alloa, and the whole street was closed. Like, we went to obviously protest, to have a counter protest to it, and that's something for me what the local community could do and what we can do. And what for me the scary thing was, the people in Alloa, they didn't have a clue what was going on, so it was kind of like a drama created by the police, because the police was like putting barricades there, and they were like, you two just fight, and it was like waste of money. You're wasting the state's money. There was like helicopter. It was like a Sunday. There was like hundreds of police, and it was like, what are you even doing? You're just like wasting your own money. Like, you're wasting our tax money. You're wasting everyone's time and money. But for me, the important thing was to be out there, because if we were not out there, who was going to be out there? If we don't go and protest, or if we don't go and raise our voice, we cannot wait for anyone else to come do it for us. So I think for me that's the important thing. And in terms of the question about institution, if there is not, then you just have to find creative ways to do it, and smash the institution and smash the system. Basically, that's my message. Left festival going on.
Okay, thank you very much. I know everybody wants to applaud, and please do, feel free.
Smash the system.
Yes, that's what everybody wants to do. So, do we have more answers to the question of, actually, smashing the system?
Well, I guess I will talk about art institutions, because I feel that that's something at least I can contribute to based on experience and the mileage. And I mean, it's another. I'm wondering what you're thinking about this, because I do come from the Republic of Slovenia, which is so small that in a way it's a really nice petri dish, because everything's so condensed that you can kind of see these basically things kind of happen much quicker, or the outcome of an action is much faster, just because there's less people involved. And I do think that institutions can grow, and art institutions. Institutional critique has been kind of included in kind of general production quite long ago. But now the question is, what is the new institutional critique, and how can it be progressive, and can it be progressive? And I must say there have been some art institutions, even in the UK, that have amazingly transformed themselves, under new leadership of women. And so I am actually extremely hopeful of this. And it's again, we are working in very different fields, of course, but art has been proven that, you know, it does do massive good for society, you know. And we live in a country where, so my 10-year-old daughter doesn't have art anymore at schools. They cut that, you know. Yeah, no more art. So, you know, it's just these little things that kind of, you know, and also the other thing is like the word creativity, from, you know, from my perspective, I mean, I only see that it has value in every other field than art. You know, you look at any kind of descriptions of courses or thinking of, you know, law and economics, whatever, it's all about creative thinking and think tanks and so on. So, you know, where does the state go if you take away creativity, creative thinking? And it's, I wouldn't smash the institutions down, but I would maybe, I don't know, sit them down in the room for a really long time and make them...
Talking more about the general system of, smashing everything down.
Yeah, but I think it's
something new from grassroots where people have the power.
I know, but these are these grandiose narratives, which, you know, I think they're so dreading. And it's, when you're talking about burnout, you know, this is what is my fear, you know, that I've been doing this for 20 years, and I am actually kind of starting to experience, I've never had burnout, but I'm starting to kind of get there, and I don't want to get there, because exactly, I'm not going to be of any use to my team, to my collaborators, you know, to the people I want to reach, and it's, you know, because this whole kind of the system is just so flawed and so terribly sort of daunting that you kind of don't know where to start. So back to recycling, you know, do we even recycle anymore? Where do you start, you know? And I think this is where, you know, I kind of chose to stay within the arts, and I do think, I mean, for me personally, political activism is different from art practices. I mean, my art practice is not a case of political activism, even though it is a political practice. And I am a political activist, but I take it a bit outside of my practice. So this is something that, again, personal politics, I chose this with a reason, because, you know, if I go and I make a film in the UN, I can't smash the institution. Do you know what I mean? You know, but I can get I can get a symposium together with the diplomats and actually bring, you know, my people, they bring in their people, and we're actually talking about, you know, substance. So that's what I'm trying to do, and that's my method, which is, you know, it's really back to this idea that, you know, I'm trying to work within the system with the system's own code of messaging, because I don't know how else to get there.
I think that's, for me, smashing the system in a different form. So it's still smashing the system, basically.
I mean, that's all I've ever been doing all my life. And the thing is that, you know, if we're going to try to go into the current systems, we don't have enough time. We are running out of time. Come on, we are running out of time, people.
I think this is the fundamental
issue. We are running out of time on so many different levels. Enough talking. We have to start doing stuff. It is so important. And so, you know, that's why I totally support Extinction Rebellion. I totally support, you know, all activism that aims to raise awareness and demand that people that know tell the truth. I just recently found out, for example, me and Jasmina were talking about, you know, not buying stuff. And, you know, I recently found out by watching a documentary, 10% of, you know, global emissions come from the fashion industry. Then I also recently found out that one of the most sort of energy consuming product in the world is iron and concrete. And it's still this demand to build and build and build, and there are these empty cities in China, massive cities, nobody lives there, so that they can keep this fake economy going. And if we do not act immediately, every day, doing disruption, then there is no future. I'm sorry, there is no future that we want to live in, because it's got, you know, look at Australia, it's just burning, out of season. The fires in Siberia, the permafrost is thawing. What about all the glaciers that are melting really quickly in the Himalayas? I mean, it's like all the people that depend on the water there. And then we are upset a few refugees come. That we call them tourist refugees because they are looking for better life. What we're you know, for example, the empire of the Great Britain doing when they went to India and all the other countries when they're looking for better life for themselves by exploiting all these people and their resources. We have new masters now. There are new masters in the world. And if we do not change the way we are, the changes has to start in us, not there, here. It's the only change that matters. If we do not change our day-to-day lives and patterns, it doesn't matter who you put in that institution, or if you change the name and the function, you will get exactly the same behavior, because it is the human condition and the way we have been taught to be we have this hierarchy, always. There's always this hierarchy. And it's so hard for us to get out of it. And even if you create the perfect circle of power, there is still always this tendency of transferring your power and responsibility to other people, because it's just too much. And so the revolution only starts in our hearts. Only there.
Of course, it can stand there, but then it can be beaten down by the police and the army, as we know. I wanted to add just to what Birgitta said, that there's going to be millions, of course, of climate refugees. As we know, this is just a matter of time, because what is going on is absolutely true, and we are running out of time. In addition to which, it's true that Scotland is, at the other side of the European border, kind of closer to Iceland, but Greece, for instance, and Italy, and especially Greece, which is at the other border, we are talking about thousands upon thousands of refugees, effectively. There is the state, not the Greek state. There are a number of states involved in this. They practice necropolitical practices, pretty much allowing them to drown. And when this doesn't happen, they really put them in the new concentration camps, the concentration camps of our era, where you have a lot more thousands, of people than the capacity of the camps. The most notorious of these camps is in the island where I was born, Lesbos, which is near the border with Turkey. And we suspect, or perhaps we know for a long time now, that it's not an accident that the conditions are so hideous there. The camp, Moria is the name, is a sign to the dispossessed that they shouldn't come, because if they come, this is what will happen to them. They will be rounded up in a concentration camp. We really need to think about this carefully. As we do, fascists are thinking about this very carefully, and some of them are in government, even if they wouldn't openly self-identify as that, because, we're still with a generation that remembers the Nazi camps. I fear that when this generation goes, and of course, the Nazi camps, we know that they were based on the colonial camps of, which I'm not, you know of which country. If you don't know, you should really look it up. And yes, but I will open this at this point. It was just supposed to be an additional remark to you to get comments and responses or questions. That was at the far back, sorry, yes.
This is a question for nobody in particular, but in response to what Birgitta just said about us running out of time. And it also relates to my personal motivations. Do you think that art can play a part in this doing that we need to do, and very quickly as we're running out of time, or do you think it's too tied to this violent system that's causing all of these problems, and that a belief that art could change things is actually just naive? I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
we need artists. We need artists because artists very often, not all of them, but many of them, think in a different way. And they are capable of offering an alternative way to deal with massive problems. And so, making art, doing art that has some meaning, that is not just, navel-gazing yourself, is extremely important, So, no, it's not naive.
Yeah, I agree. I think definitely art does play a huge role in it, whether this is at a local or a kind of national level at it. Any sort of using art as a tool for change is obviously beneficial. In terms of like what we do with the theatre, we tend to, like I said earlier, speak with audiences and people to raise awareness and to create dialogue, to talk about but also to understand why they think the way they think. And I think that's where all the problems comes from. Obviously, I assume in this audience, we all agree that we need to make change and we are all on the same page. But it's those who we don't engage with is where the change needs to also come as well, and where we also need to engage. A good example is this year at the Scottish Refugee Festival, there was an artist in St. Enoch Square where he put like a car and it was like stones and rubble, so it was meant, it was representing like the war, and it reached so many people where if it was in an art gallery or if it was in a place where we have the usual suspects coming along to it, it was not going to reach that many people. So it was out in the space and it was reaching so many people, and they were actually stopping, engaging and thinking. So I think that for me is a huge change, because you're changing people's mind, you're actually allowing people to think. And I think that's what we need people to think critically. And just coming back to earlier when someone was saying about what the people need to do to think about it, we need to be more reading about Marxism, we need to read books on socialism. That's what we need to do. We need, obviously, the facts about you mentioned about people are going to forget World War II and what happened in the concentration camps, and it's the same. We need to remember those theories. We need to remember and carry those theories forward, whether this is about Marxism or looking at socialism and looking at how we could anarchism, every sort of isms. We need to critically think about them. We need to read, and if there is a group or if there isn't a group, we all have the power to create a group within our local areas. Whether this is at university here or in Dundee, you could easily create a reading group and look at chapters of Paulo Freire, looking at critical thinking and looking at those kind of readings. And I think that power lies in our hands to do it, not in anyone else's.
I think it's definitely about asking the questions, and I always think of it, it's that whole thing. I was saying this actually when I did the talk here, because I remember that moment as a young student, art student, kind of going like, oh my God, I can't change the world. What the fuck am I going to do? And my professor said, think of it as a hat of cultural capital. Like, you go and see a show, you go and hear a concert, you take something out, and you make something, you put something back in. And if we all stopped making anything, culture would not grow together with the social change. And the new space, the new social space demands different questions and different answers. So I think this is where we're all we are in solidarity, even if we work completely separately. But we are this kind of new wave of pushing the new questions that just need to be asked.
Refrain from giving my view here. Yes, please. You raised your hand before, or yeah.
Hello. Yeah, I guess it's just to raise the question of the Labour Party, because it really touches on a lot of the things, the idea of the army outside and the in and against the state, whether you can reform something that gave us the Iraq War and climate change and all of those things. And so I guess views from the room, views from everyone about what the potentials and pitfalls and limitations and hopes are related to that institution.
Could you Sorry, what was the end of your question? I mean,
I suppose about the potentials and the limitations and...
Of the Labour Party?
Yeah. In this electoral moment.
Wow. Okay. I will, yeah, please, people answer quickly, and then I'll just take one last question. And
My father was a Marxist professor. I cannot answer this question.
Well, I can say something. Like, I think it is very important. Like, you have this really fucked up system, election system here, right? And I know that last elections, the Greens gave up a lot of seats for the Labour Party. Why do people not create alliances instead of like, you know, so let's say there is an alliance, an agreement. This is what this bloc is going to do together. And, you know, why doesn't the Labour Party or any party say, look, we're sick of this two-party system that we have here. Here is what we do. If we have enough majority to form a coalition government, we're all going to be in the government together or in the shadow government together. Because the way it's structured, nobody is willing to give up power. And that's the problem here. So in regard to, you know, the policy is very interesting, but it's like they're talking about like a green industrial revolution. What the fuck is that? I mean, seriously. So, you know, I personally, if I was voting here, I would vote for the Green Party all the way.
Thank you. I, on the other hand, who don't vote here, as I'm excluded as a national subject, and I'm only allowed to vote in Scotland because it doesn't matter. I'm only allowed to vote at the European election. That doesn't matter either. And I'm also allowed to vote at the local election, which definitely doesn't matter. So I'm obviously not allowed, despite the fact of having lived here all my adult life, to vote. So nonetheless, I'm a member of the Labour Party, and I think there is no such thing as a Labour Party. There is now a Corbyn-led Labour Party, and I wish it the best because it's the only hope we've got. So that's my short answer. And I'm going to take one last, okay, yes.
I don't actually have a question. I never have a question. My heart starts pounding and I want to speak, but there's a gap between how intelligent I sound and how intelligent I think I am and how intelligent I sound. Will you look after me?
Absolutely.
What has happened to us? To the values we used to share? The balance has tilted in their favour, at the expense of our individual freedom. But our relative decline is not inevitable.